on enabling accountability for artificial intelligence. I would now like to invite Mr. Boštjan Koritnik, the Slovenian Minister of Public Administration, and Mr. Ulrich Knudsen, Deputy Secretary General of the OECD, to give their opening remarks. Please, Boštjan, floor is yours.
Dear Ambassador Ješovnik, dear Deputy Secretary General Knudsen, distinguished guests, dear participants of the webinar. I'm honored to be part of this webinar that is organized by the Slovenian Presidency of the EU Council together with the OECD. Namely, the field of artificial intelligence is particularly important for Slovenia. As you probably know, we have more than 40 years of research experience in AI, and we are proud of many eminent Slovene scientists working in almost 100 research groups whose work include artificial intelligence. The reward for their outstanding work is without any doubt the first International Research Center for Artificial Intelligence, IRCAI, established under the auspices of UNESCO this year in Ljubljana. Our national program for artificial intelligence supports concrete measures to ensure research, innovation, deployment, and use of AI systems throughout the innovation lifecycle in 6 priority areas: health, industry 4.0, public administration, language technologies, sustainable food production, and environment and spatial planning. Also, artificial intelligence is one of the high priority areas of our presidency. I firmly believe that AI systems should be human-centric and in the service of humanity and the common good. Our vision should therefore be to ensure trustworthy AI. This requires a holistic, systemic approach and integrating all actors, all processes. Trustworthy AI is based on 3 components which should be met throughout the system's entire life cycle. Firstly, AI should be lawful, complying with all applicable laws and regulations. Secondly, it should be ethical, ensuring ethical principles and values. And thirdly, it should be robust, both from a technical and social perspective, since even with good intentions, AI systems can cause unintentional harm. While offering great opportunities for our democracy, business, and work, AI systems also give rise to certain risks. These risks must be handled appropriately and proportionately, from unacceptable risk where the use of AI is banned, to high risk where its use is subject to strict obligations before put on the market, and finally to minimal risk where AI is freely used. And we all know, and I emphasize that every time, with artificial intelligence, trust is a must. Therefore, we should emphasize ethical technology, safety, fundamental rights, and values of our citizens. The new rules should be also applied directly in the same way across all member states, and this is how we create unified and trustworthy environment. As you all know, the European Commission tabled the proposal for regulation of artificial intelligence in April this year, and this act is the first of its kind at the global level and represents a new step in regulating AI solutions. Since then, we've had a number of discussions at all levels on standardization, effective control, and accountability of stakeholders, human-centered approach to AI, innovation in AI, green transition, necessary knowledge and skills for seizing the AI opportunities, to mention only a few. First, at the expert level, Telecom Working Party at the Council has been working intensively to present the first compromise proposal or a progress report by December. Also, several workshops on AI have been organized at the Council, bringing together a number of various stakeholders. In September, we organized together with the European Commission a high-level conference on artificial intelligence with almost 1,800 participants from around the world. At the political level, the Slovenian presidency organized in October an informal meeting of telecommunication ministers who gave their first views on the regulation of AI issues and expressed their clear support for a comprehensive AI Act which could serve as a model worldwide. I would also like to seize the opportunity and congratulate the OECD for all their work in the field of artificial intelligence. And thanks to them, we have today the definition on AI that is used globally. We also have important policy documents and projects such as recommendation on AI, which is a basis for G20 artificial intelligence principles, AI Policy Observatory, and Global Policy.ai, to name just a few. Also, I shouldn't forget our colleagues from the Slovenian Institute Josef Stefan, who play an important role in many activities related to AI. Ladies and gentlemen, at this stage, we're discussing and exploring the benefits that AI can have for our lives. It is also important to explore the opportunities for creating a trusted AI system and reflect on how to create an accountable environment in order to achieve this goal. I'm convinced that individuals, organizations, and societies will only be able to realize the full potential of AI if trust can be established in its development, deployment, and use. I wish you a successful and fruitful discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Boštjan. Ulrich, can you take the floor?
Yes, thank you, Peter. Thank you very much, Minister Korytnik. It's a pleasure to join you today and for the OECD to co-host this event on this very crucial topic of enabling accountability for trustworthy AI. Of course, taking place, as been said already a number of times now, as part of Slovenia's EU Council presidency. And I should also add, I think, building on what is becoming a legacy of great cooperation between the OECD and Slovenia on AI. I see also Marko Grobolig on the screen there somewhere. Good to see you, Marko. Over the next 2 hours, our distinguished speakers will discuss their individual and collective efforts to lay the foundation and build evidence for trustworthy AI. They will also reflect on how we may achieve more global interoperability in assessing and mitigating risks so that AI can be deployed to the benefit of humans and our planet alike. The OECD has been working hard to contribute to these efforts over the past years, from the OECD AI principles in 2019. Then they later became the AI G20 principles, to the critical OECD network on experts on AI, and also the ever-growing, of course, evidence base housed in our online Oecd.ai policy observatory, as was also mentioned by Minister Korytnik. Using data from Oecd.ai, we're starting to see a much clearer picture of the truly incredible growth underway in artificial intelligence. For example, a recent OECD study published earlier this month looked at who is actually investing in AI firms. What we found is that in 2020 alone, venture capital investments in AI represented over $80 billion, and that's just the private companies. In fact, AI startups now account for over 20% of all VC investments. It also has to be said that the United States and China lead the way, together attracting 80% of venture capital in 2020, followed then by the EU, Britain, and Japan. Looking at sector level, the transportation sector leads overall investment, perhaps pointing to our driverless future, who knows, followed by investments in health, pharmaceuticals, and biotechnology sectors. They all skyrocketed in 2020, no surprise, with the pandemic and increasing demand for personalized healthcare. The third largest investments in AI are going towards business process tools, which reflect the role of AI in increasing efficiency and productivity in the workplace. This leads me to our efforts on AI and work innovation, productivity, and skills, where another recent report shows who's actually developing AI-related innovations, goods and services through patents and trademarks. Here we're seeing the same trends with significant growth since 2014 of AI-related patents and trademarks. The 5 companies with the largest AI intellectual property portfolios own 14% of the total IP portfolio related to AI, pointing to market concentration in this field. Finally, in looking at current and future AI jobs, including the skills people need to be able to leverage AI, we find that not only are machine learning and data skills critical for new jobs today, but so too actually are teamwork and socio-emotional skills. In other words, humans need to be able to ask the right questions so AI can solve the right problems. These skills are, I'm happy to say, inherently human. You can find these and other reports on the OECD.ai Observatory, where we are constantly adding new analysis, data, and interactive visualizations. While the OECD develops evidence-based public policy recommendations in a multi-stakeholder fashion, cutting-edge research and pilot projects on AI priorities are also critical to advancing trustworthy AI. For this reason, the OECD is proud to host the Secretariat of the Global Partnership on AI, an international initiative that promotes responsible AI use through applied pilot projects and experiments. We're also working to deepen cooperation on AI with other intergovernmental institutions and organizations. They may have complementary mandates and shared values on trustworthy AI, human rights, and democracy. So I'm happy to see today also on the call, on the screen, some of them here. I think the European Commission is here, the Inter-American Development Bank, and the Council of Europe. I'm also very happy to see expert speakers from member countries such as Germany and Spain, and I may even have missed a few others. I'd like to invite all panelists today to think critically about where we stand and where we would like to go, of course, regarding accountability in artificial intelligence. And as you do so, I also beg you to think about if there are places where we at the OECD could help you and us get there. With that, let me conclude and pass the floor back to Ambassador Josovnik and wish you a very productive session today. Peter, back to you.
Thank you very much, Boštjan and Ulrich, for setting the stage for this webinar and for highlighting the great work undertaken by Slovenia, the EU and OECD to foster the development and deployment of trustworthy artificial intelligence. I would like to move on to first panel of the day on building the evidence base to enable accountability towards trustworthy artificial intelligence, where our esteemed panelists will discuss existing efforts they are undertaking to build the evidence base to enable accountability for artificial intelligence. We would like to have 2 rounds of interventions today. So let's try to stick to 4 minutes for the first question, if that's okay for everyone. Let me start with, my pleasure is now to introduce Andy Vikov, the Director of Science, Technology and Innovation Director at the OECD. Andy, let me start with the question. How does the OECD Policy Observatory aims to help countries share and shape public policy for trustworthy artificial intelligence? Could you please elaborate on how OECD is helping build on evidence base to do this? Please, Andy.
Thank you, Ambassador, and good morning to, good afternoon to everyone. It's my pleasure to participate in this panel and particularly this topic because evidence is at the heart of how the OECD approaches public policy analysis. And OECD.ai is the mechanism by which we do this to track the most recent developments and trends in AI, including AI policy, but also software development, research, investments, and skills. In terms of AI policy, the OECD, working with the European Commission through Joint Research Center, and I'm really happy to see Carlos Torrecilla today here. Together, we've developed a database of national AI policies that now counts more than 700 different policy initiatives coming from 63 different countries. The repository, I think, is an incredibly valuable resource for helping countries learn from each other and for us to track how policies are addressing OECD's AI principles or not, kind of putting policy into practice. The OECD.ai also tracks many other relevant empirical data points, which I think help to dispel some of the hype that comes naturally around AI. And let me just point out a few trends that I think are really worth noting. And I note that Deputy Secretary General Knudsen has just mentioned a few, but there's a lot more out on the OECD.ai Observatory. So the first is I just want to talk about how the science is growing tremendously. Global AI scientific publications have over the last 5 years have grown by 36%. Now, that's almost double the amount of scientific publications in general that we're tracking. So this is clearly on an upward trajectory. Second, and very importantly, and I know we've got Michael Schonstein here, we're tracking skills, particularly with support from the German Ministry of Labor. And demand for AI skills over the last 3 years have also grown. Today, a job opening is 1.5 times more likely to require AI skills like machine learning than just 3 years ago. And this has implications for how we get ready for this new environment. And in just 5 years, AI software development, as measured from GitHub, which I'll explain in a second, has around the world grown by almost a dramatic 900%. So again, we've just seen this liftoff happening right now. And on this note, I'm actually happy to announce today we are launching a new set of indicators leveraging data from GitHub. This is a software development platform that has more than 60 million users globally. These indicators on how we use GitHub and who's using it and creating in GitHub can help shed light on the development of AI software, where it's happening, how fast it's growing, and which development tools are being developed. And thanks to these new indicators, we now know that almost half of the total AI software development in GitHub in 2020 originated from 2 countries, the United States, probably no surprise there, but also India. And they had respective shares of 18% and 30% respectively. Now, this hasn't always been the case. The share of Indian contributions to AI projects was only 7% in 2015, while the share of contributions from the US has almost halved over this period. Now, this isn't because the US produces any less, it's because the overall supply, the denominator, has grown dramatically, thanks to India and other countries helping to expand it. Now, this picture changes when we look at the quality of those AI projects. For example, contributions to high impact AI projects in 2020 came primarily from developers from the US and China. India, however, in this case was a close third. The same trend is from US, China, and India is observed for the most popular AI projects. And again, this just speaks to how important it is to engage with India because they're quickly becoming a leading player in AI. Now, let me just end by saying all this data is available on OECD.ai and can help governments monitor the impact of their AI policies and initiatives. And last but not least, I want to echo something that Ulrich Knudsen has said. I want to recognize the very fruitful partnership that we've had with Slovenia, particularly with Marko Grobolig and his team that help us process the data and make it available on OECD.ai. Thank you.
Thank you, Andy. The OECD Policy Observatory serves as a great resource for data and evidence on artificial intelligence. It's in particular very exciting to hear about the new data on artificial software development that the OECD has just made available on the OECD.ie. Now, please allow me to introduce Carlos Torresilla Salinas, Head of Digital Economy Unit at the Joint Research Center of the European Commission. Carlos, thank you for joining us. Let me start with a question for you. The European Commission Joint Research Center has important initiatives underway to measure and monitor emerging technologies. How is the GRC measuring and monitoring the development, uptake, and impact of artificial intelligence technologies in Europe, also in view of European Commission proposal for artificial intelligence regulation or so-called AI Act? Please,
thank you very much, Ambassador. And thank you to the OECD and to the Slovenian government for your kind invitation. Indeed, as part of the GRC role of scientific advisor of the European Commission, we have developed technology monitoring and forecasting capacities. In particular, and related to AI, the GRC started working on this particular set of technologies a long time ago. And it was already 2018 when we published our flagship report called Artificial Intelligence and European Perspective, in which we tried to analyze AI already from an holistic point of view, including not only the technological aspects, but also the social, economic, and cultural dimensions. With the adoption of the first version of the European Coordinated Plan for Artificial Intelligence, already in 2018, the Commission decided to set up AI Watch. AI Watch is the European Commission knowledge service for the monitoring of the uptake of AI in Europe, and is a joint project of the Joint Research Center and DG Connect. Since then, AI Watch has been gathering information and producing knowledge, which has been very useful for the update of the Coordinated Plan on Artificial Intelligence in 2021, but also to provide scientific evidence to our colleagues in DG Connect that were in charge of the AI Act that the ambassador mentioned just a few seconds ago. In particular, AI Watch is monitoring four main elements. One, the EU industrial, technological, and research capacity on artificial intelligence, trying to map the AI landscape in Europe, but also worldwide. Second, the AI-related policies and national strategies in the different EU member states. Linked to this point, I would like to mention the joint report we published together with the OECD this spring, analyzing in detail those national strategies. Third, the uptake of AI within some particular strategic sectors of the economy, like health, it has been mentioned before by Director Wyckoff, the mobility of the public sector. And fourth, the AI impact on economic growth, jobs, education, and society. Linked to this mandate, I would like to highlight some of the recent AI Watch reports and results that might be related to the AI Act and might be of interest for the audience. I would like to start mentioning our recent report around the AI standardization landscape. As you know, the AI Act is based in the NLF, the new legislative framework, a well-proven legislative framework that uses the concept of harmonized standards to prove compliance with high-level requirements required in a certain legal text. Our work researches the alignment between the AI-related standards, either the already existing ones or those that are in the pipeline, and the proposed requirements within the AI Act. Our ultimate goal is to identify gaps and underdeveloped areas in which extra efforts would be needed, with the global goal of defining a European standardization roadmap that could help the full implementation of the AI Act. One of the main conclusions of this report is that we already have a number of core standards that could be used as base for the implementation of the AI Act. However, we have identified already some significant gaps. For instance, in the field of documentation of AI systems, for which still significant efforts are required to get a full implementation of the AI Act. Together with this work, I would also like to mention the work we have done around AI investments, in which we have presented an attempt to estimate economy-wide the AI investments in order to monitor them over time. Our approach includes all relevant investment types and actors, going beyond direct investments and considering also investment in complementary assets and capabilities, like skills, data, product design, or organizational capital. We think our work will be very useful to monitor the implementation of the EU Coordinated Plan, and in particular, the progress of the European Union towards its goal of 20 billion euros of annual investments that has been set as a target by 2013. Another very relevant piece of work is the one we do around the use of AI in the public sector. And we have just published a new piece of work called Beyond Pilots, Sustainable Implementation of AI in Public Services, in which we present a new approach for the adoption of AI within government that should go beyond the small-scale proof of concepts of pilot to get a sustainable implementation and adoption of AI within the government. Finally, I would like to mention our work linked to the AI uptake in the smart mobility sector, where we have identified that AI-driven smart mobility applications have the potential to improve the management of traffic flows, enhance the road safety, and extend the access to mobility to those that do not possess vehicles. We see that AI in smart mobility is experiencing fast growth, with the main part of the enabled technologies being developed in China and the United States. These are just few examples on how the GRC monitors the uptake of technology and helps the European Commission in the implementation of the AI Act. But there are many more. And I invite the audience to visit the AI Watch portal so they would find this information and many other that is of interest for them. And with that, I conclude and I send it back to the ambassador. Thank you very much.
Thanks for that, Carlos. It's very good to see just how active the GRC has been in measuring and monitoring developments in artificial intelligence and artificial intelligence policy. We have heard what international organizations are doing to build the evidence base to enabling accountability in artificial intelligence. Now, we would like to hear more about what's going on at the national level. Michael Schonstein is Head of Strategic Foresight and Analysis at the German Federal Ministry of Labor and Social Affairs. Thank you for joining us today, Michael. Let me ask you with the question. Germany's approach to artificial intelligence has a strong focus on labor and building human capacity in artificial intelligence. In fact, the German national artificial intelligence strategy is strongly linked to the skilled labor strategy and the digital work initiative. Germany is one of the first governments that is building indicators to measure the impact of artificial intelligence in the workforce. Could you tell us more about this work, please, Michael?
Thank you, Peter, and thank you indeed very much overall to the Slovenian Presidency for the kind invitation to participate in this panel and to the OECD for co-hosting it. I'll be delighted to elaborate very briefly on our work in this regard, because as you say correctly, we have a slightly different focus than many other countries, putting very much the impact on work and society at the forefront of our AI strategy. In principle, there are three work streams I would like to highlight. They are all documented also on our website. So while I'll be very brief here, of course, I'm happy to dive deeper during the Q&A, and everything's available on the website as well. First of all, it is very important to work on an overview. And I think we've already heard examples from monitoring the diffusion of artificial intelligence in a number of respects. Both Ulrich, Andy, and Carlos have alluded to that. And we're indeed collaborating very closely with the OECD on the work program on artificial intelligence and work innovation, productivity and skills, AI WIPS, as well as an active member of AI Watch. And both are really great collaborations where we find that working together with the European and international level really benefits us to a great extent, monitoring what is going on, especially when it comes to the big unknown questions around skills that are, of course, essential for us. Monitoring alternative data sources, such as the GitHub data that Andy mentioned, but also looking at people's LinkedIn profiles and looking what new skills are emerging around artificial intelligence have proven very, very important information for our policymaking, specifically in directing resources for lifelong learning to the places where they're most needed. But we're also monitoring the uptake of artificial intelligence in broader society. And for example, we have created an additional module in our socioeconomic panel that is handled by the German Institute for Economic Research to continuously poll households about their use of artificial intelligence. We find that this is a very important complementary information to look at the workplace, but to also look at a broader societal take-up. And in that respect, there's also a further a piece of work in this work stream that looks at the perception of artificial intelligence by the population. We find that it's also very important to monitor how is artificial intelligence talked about? What are people's feelings when they actually have to think about artificial intelligence or are confronted with AI-based applications in their lives? And for example, we find that contrary to the media reporting that is often relatively negative, the population views on artificial intelligence are very nuanced and actually quite opportunity-oriented, which is also something that's quite important, I think, for the political communication around artificial intelligence. Our second work stream builds on this. Information about diffusion is important, but it doesn't really tell us much about the impact of technologies. And so to understand better causalities, we are engaging in several experimental approaches. For example, we work with test beds in small and medium enterprises where we have a small number, 13 enterprises that we accompany in their take-up of artificial intelligence, each company for about 2 years in a co-creative process with their works council to see how they introduce which kind of application to what effect. But what we're also doing next to that in a slightly methodologically more pure format is that we're conducting randomized controlled trials with artificial intelligence in large companies, because you need a large enough group, of course, in your workplace in order to have a treatment and a control group. But what we're doing there is really equipping a group in a functional area of a company with an AI-based tool, and then compare to a control group what is actually the impact on their tasks, on their productivity, and on the satisfaction of the people with their work that work with an AI-based tool. I think this is a very important area of work that is sometimes a little bit difficult to do, but I think essential, especially when we look at the regulatory approaches that are being discussed right now. It is very important to understand the causalities around and map the impacts. And going yet one step further, we, of course, also aware of the fact that a lot of companies are using artificial intelligence already, and nobody's waiting for us to find out what the good impacts are and then regulate them in the best way. But there is a lot of deployment going on. And we try to accompany as many firms as possible in their development of guidelines about how to best deploy artificial intelligence. And I would like to emphasize that this is different from regulation. This is really about the hands-on shop floor introduction of a new tool. Who do you actually ask about what their needs are when they need an assistance from a system that works with artificial intelligence? How do you inform the Works Council best? How do you check for the training data, the biases that may be there? How do you train a model to best fit in your company? What are aspects that you can look for? And we do this in two ways. We work with a number of companies. Right now, there's around about 30, and they range from very small companies with 4 or 5 workers all the way to large corporations with tens of thousands of employees. And we try to foster a comparison between different types of guidelines that are developed in those different settings. But we're also looking into our own backyard, if you like, and very much work in the same way. So also in a co-creative way with the agencies that are in the portfolio of the Federal Ministry of Labor and Social Affairs to look at developing guidelines for the use of artificial intelligence in labor and social administration. So this includes the employment agency, the pension insurance system, and the accident insurance system, for example. And there's about 20 agencies that we work with, and we hope that by March we will be publishing the guidelines by which they are deploying artificial intelligence. I think what all of this shows is that there's a great spectrum of work that can be done, but also that has to be done in order to foster accountable artificial intelligence. And I look forward to continued exchange in this panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael. It's great to hear about all the amazing initiatives undertaken at the national level in Germany. We are also delighted to have with us today Mr. Alberto Mercante, Technical Advisor at the Ministry of Economic Affairs and Digital Transformation of Spain. Alberto, let me ask you the following question. Spain has recently launched and is planning to launch different projects that promote the role of SMEs in the field of artificial intelligence in line with the EU's coordinated plan on artificial intelligence. How has Spain done this, and how is the country preparing its next actions? More specifically, what are the comparative advantages and potential challenges, including in terms of measurement and sandboxing experience? Please, Albert.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, for that. So I will start talking about the precise SMEs projects we have in Spain. And then on the second part, I will talk to you about the accountability and other kind of projects we are also having. So in the first part, obviously, SMEs are very important for Spain because they are the basis of our economic tissue. Therefore, it's crucial for us to boost and foster their growth, particularly the artificial intelligence plan. For doing this, we have a wide variety of tools, but I think the most interesting one to present today is the missions on AI. This is one of the initiatives that we did as part of our national strategy on AI, which of course derives from the 2019 OECD principles. And the idea here is to do a different motion thinking about how can we promote investment in artificial intelligence. We want to promote research and development to address the big challenges in the field. In particular, we want to tackle major challenges in the fields of agriculture, health, mobility, environment, and employment, which are big issues in Spain, as they are in most of the different OECD members with different varieties and proportions. And the key idea we are having is we are looking for disruptive projects. But the interesting thing is what their composition is. These projects must include a big company, at least one SME, and a research agency. The idea of having these big collaborative projects is to focus public resources into one field that is often not looked after, which is how they can interplay and share knowledge and resources in a way that brings together the best from each field. This helps the three legs, obviously, but in particular, it helps SMEs because on the one hand, they are much more related with the intellectual work doing by research agencies, and they have a good way of scaling up using these novel technologies. And on the other hand, by being linked to a blue chip company, which is well known, they have an easier way of making themselves known, because as we said today a number of times, most of the uses of artificial intelligence are in sectors dominated by big companies. So if you want to have an SME in the, for example, in the vehicle, in the motor industry, then obviously you need to peg with a big company that actually makes the cars and makes it easier for you to transfer this technology to them. So with this project, we will see what the results are, but there is very interesting OECD research from a few years ago that suggests that this way of doing projects, of allocating public money, is almost twice as effective as traditional subsidies and other mechanisms. So we will see in the future whether this pans out. Then answering to the second part of your question, in Spain we have launched a number of sandboxes. Probably the recent one that came into law a few months ago is the financial sector sandbox, in which also helps SMEs by accepting collaborative projects with big financial entities in areas in which the use of AI could be tricky from a regulatory point of view. And then we are also planning sandboxes in other areas such as employment or energy. Regarding accountability, we have launched also the Ethics Observatory in Spain, which is aimed at overseeing the whole architecture of AI in Spain and ensuring it is accountable and it is actually human-centered, which, as we've said today, it's one of the most important goals this should have. Thank you very much, Peter.
Thank you, Alberto, for interesting account of Spain artificial intelligence monitoring mechanism and regulatory sandbox experiences. And lastly, I'd like to now pass it on to Marinka Žitnik, Assistant Professor of Biomedical Informatics at Harvard University. Dear Marinka, the Žitnik Lab at the Harvard Medical School leads some very interesting work leveraging data science and machine learning methods to generate insights to medicine and science, such as using millions of medical reports to track disease development and progression and identify adverse drug effects. How could these novel methods help policymakers to design, track, and improve their artificial intelligence policies? In other words, how can artificial intelligence itself be used to help design and monitor artificial intelligence policy? Please, floor is yours.
Thank you for this introduction. It's great to be at this panel today. So as many have said, AI really holds tremendous promise in enabling scientific breakthroughs and discoveries in diverse areas. And we see now increasing use of AI methods in important domains that often involve taking life or death decisions. Because of that, we need algorithms that not only are optimized for accuracy, which is what traditionally most of the development of AI algorithms has focused on. Instead, we need algorithms that can also be very robust, and we need to have mechanisms that can ensure that these models behave responsibly, are trustworthy, and that there are checks and balances built into the deployment of these algorithms. So these kind of questions arise in a variety of different areas where we see increasing applications of AI methods, such as law, healthcare, autonomous driving. I will spend the next few minutes talking primarily about the importance and relevance of AI for the domains that are related to life sciences, biotechnology, and healthcare. So in those settings, as I said, the optimized accuracy of machine learning models is no longer enough. Instead, there are other criteria that we need to consider when we develop algorithms as well as deploy them in practical settings. And so those includes having models that can produce explainable predictions, models that are interpretable, models that can produce predictions that are fair and non-discriminatory against certain patient populations or certain groups in a population or a country, and also models that often are privacy preserving and robust and causal. So in my research group at Harvard, we are developing algorithms and then partnering with a variety of stakeholders in order to also practically deploy these algorithms in different settings. So let me mention just 3 examples. So we work very closely with a large number of pharmaceutical companies in order to use through novel data sources and AI technologies and accelerate the development of safe and effective therapeutics. As you can imagine, that's incredibly important and currently incredibly time-intensive and resource-intensive project, as it takes on average between $2 to $3 billion and costs between $11 and $16 billion to develop a new drug completely from scratch. So what we have recently shown is that with a partnership between academia and industry collaborators, it's possible to compress years of time into months and even weeks in some cases by very closely working with domain experts, in this case biologists and biomedical researchers, and making sure that the tools that they have are based on trustworthy AI and can produce actionable predictions that can lend themselves practically to immediately to downstream experiments that they do in the wet lab. We also work very closely with regulatory agencies in the United States. In particular, my research and my lab advises to the FDA on what is the right roadmap on how AI algorithms can be approved in healthcare settings, as we see an increasing interest and actually several applications from large big tech companies submitting applications to FDA with the medicines that have digital components, like online apps or various kind of digital patches that have learned mechanisms. And so the question then becomes, if these models are used for patients in real world, who takes the responsibility where something doesn't work well? And so that required developing completely new roadmaps at the FDA, where traditionally they thought of clinical trials and drugs that are chemicals, on how we can now regulate and ensure that the AI algorithms are employed practically in clinical settings. And lastly, what I will mention is our collaboration that I'm particularly excited about recently with the NASA and Space Agency in the United States, where we are working very closely with them on outlining a vision on where AI and modeling ought to be developed in the next decade, towards enhancing space biological knowledge discovery, and particularly supporting health for space exploration missions. And so this is the kind of frontier that's really opens completely new set of questions, but with the promise in the context of space biology, in the interest of NASA, the steady growth of data sets in that area, disease enabling AI applications for the prediction of disease risk, for identification of potential new therapeutics, and improvement of astronaut health in general. So I'm particularly excited and would like to emphasize the importance of AI experts collaborating very closely with and providing advice to regulatory agencies, which is something that is quite common in the United States. And I illustrated that through a couple of partnerships. Thank you.
Thank you, Marinka, for your expert insight into how all these new technologies could be leveraged to collect and analyze evidence of the design and monitoring of artificial intelligence policy. I'd now like to ask one or more questions to each of the panelists. Perhaps we can start with Andy, but before we start with Andy, please limit yourself to 2 minutes answer if possible. I know sometimes this is difficult. Andy, looking forward, what concrete plans does the OECD have to enable accountability in artificial intelligence by increasing the evidence base or engaging in force ethics societies? Andy.
Thank you, Ambassador. And I just want to thank all the other panelists. I think it's been a really interesting exchange. So just quickly to answer your question, we have 3 initiatives that are on the drawing board. First, the OECD plans to increase the number of data sources in OECD.ai. We love data at the OECD, and we don't think any one data point is perfect, but when you begin to combine them with many of them, you begin to see the broader AI ecosystem, and in particularly societal elements such as the AI education and AI in public companies and organizations. So to this end, we're building an online catalog that would provide AI actors and policymakers with an up-to-date repository of key tools. And these are almost software tools, such as how to bias mitigation and risk management tools to help them implement trustworthy AI systems in various contexts. Second thing we're starting on now is a repository of a legislative hub tracking emerging AI legislation around the world, but particularly in the OECD world. And we're doing this with the OECD Parliamentary Group on AI. I would note that I met with some EU parliamentarians this morning who are here discussing AI in Washington. Second, we're going to develop a database of AI incidents, which could provide useful evidence for categorization of different AI systems into risk levels and help us deliver trustworthy AI as embraced in our principles. These real life experiences, I think, are fundamental to getting our policies right. And this will be voluntary to start with, but you can see down the road, just as we have with airplane crashes and other things, this may become more of a regulatory requirement. Last but not least, we're working with Michael and his colleagues in Germany. And I want to give him a big shout out. They've been incredibly helpful at helping us advance our work at the OECD on the impact on labor market skills and social policies through a program we call AI WIPS, which is work, innovation, productivity, and skills. And I just want to end that when I talk to policymakers, this is the #1 issue that they raise. It's about the impact on the economy, our workforce, and what it means for companies who are adopting AI tools. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Andy. I'd also like to ask some questions to the rest of the panelists. Looking forward, what concrete plans does your organization or country have to enable accountability in artificial intelligence by increasing the evidence base or engaging in foresight exercises? And how do you envisage the OECD could help? Perhaps we can continue in the same order as before. So, Carlos, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ambassador. Well, first of all, we would like to continue exploring and continue our research to understand what is AI and how we can promote trustworthy AI. One of the elements that interest us the most is the use of AI in what we call high-risk scenarios. So in that sense, we try to develop and define use cases that will allow us to understand what are the risks of applying use case to one of those scenarios. Together with that, we plan to be very active in the world of AI standards. As mentioned, we think this is a key element for the implementation of the AI Act, and we think we will be very useful to our colleagues of the Connect in order to get this full implementation. We will also keep on monitoring the uptake of AI in the different I would say, strategic sectors of the economy. And one sector that interests us a lot is the use of AI in public sector. We think that public sector has been seen traditionally as a regulator or a facilitator, but it has to be seen also as a user or producer of AI in order to innovate our public services, in particular in Europe, with the importance that public sector has in the economy. And of course, we plan to continue our good collaboration with the OECD. Director Wyckoff already mentioned our collaboration in this database of AI-related strategies and policies, in which we have more than 700 AI policy initiative for more than 60 countries. We have also collaborated a lot around the analysis of the EU member states' national strategies, and we have even organized several public events. So we plan to continue this good collaboration. I think that gives an overview of the short-term plans of the GRC. Back to you, Ambassador.
Thanks for that, Carlos. Michael, could you share some thoughts of yours with us, please?
Yes, thank you very much. We will double down on our work with the OECD, and we're looking forward to hopefully extending the work on AI WIPS. And perhaps there's one area I would like to emphasize in this very broad program is that I think it's important to look at what AI and robotics can actually do. So testing the skills of the machines, if you like. And I also think that the OECD is a very valuable partner in this, building, if you like, on a intellectual history that started with testing what school students can do in the PISA program, looking at what workers can do in the PIAC program. And I think it's only logical to next look at what machines can do. And develop sort of a direct measure of skills of artificial intelligence, both statically in the moment and dynamically looking forward. At the national level, what is important for us is that we shouldn't forget about societal dialogue on artificial intelligence. I think this is tremendously important. We're profoundly convinced that only a participatory development of policy can really anchor trust in artificial intelligence in the society at large. And this is one area where we try to use foresight, developing scenarios about the future of work in 2040, using different ideas about how artificial intelligence deployment can function in order to engage the broader public in a debate on artificial intelligence, and teasing out sort of the hopes and wishes also that people have towards artificial intelligence as technology to make their lives better, which is something that we find very important. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. And now Alberto, please.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. So first of all, I think following the line of my colleagues, I think in Spain, we firmly believe in artificial intelligence, human-centered and ethic. And we have to make it very clear that AI follows the same rules as everybody else. This is a strong message that we have been convening and agreeing at in the Council of Europe and the UNESCO, for example, and is that in the same way that nobody else is allowed to be discriminatory, AI cannot be discriminatory, and we have fundamental rights, we have human dignity, and we have a number of principles that have a strong trajectory, which we are committed to respect and to make sure that AI receives no different treatment. Specifically, to address this point, we have created the Ethics Observatory I mentioned before, and to have a greater evidence base, which obviously is crucial for all policy initiatives. We have launched 6 months ago the Spanish Data Office, which aims to gather data from different sectors and as many data as possible, with a particular focus on the public sector, to make sure when we have the tools, we have the data necessary to run these tools and apply them to the Spanish reality. Then finally, there is also another accountability mechanism, which is very clear in the case of all of these policies, and the European Commission will like that. That is that since all our initiatives are done as part of the Recovery and Resilience Fund post-COVID, we have the strict monitoring of the EU, because this is EU given money, and therefore its allocation has the standard. Again, we are not inventing the wheel here. We have like strong procedures that were done in the past and agreed on, and this ensures that all the mechanism functions properly. Thank you very much, Ambassador.
Thank you, Alberto. Lastly, I'd like to pass the same question to Marinka. Marinka, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Let me mention 2 concrete initiatives that we work on in my lab to enable accountability in AI. And so the first one is on the rigorous development of tools that allow us to probe these AI algorithms and models as we see them deployed in practice. So what that practically means is that we have AI algorithms that can inspect and investigate some of the other AI algorithms themselves. And so that allows us to get an understanding for a particular prediction that was made by the algorithm, what kind of data was used to make that prediction. And then the human user can decide whether that data and the process by which prediction was generated by the algorithm is reliable and trustworthy and appropriate in a particular context. For example, whether it follows all the ethical or regulatory guidelines. And so those tools are really important and are kind of complementary direction to algorithms that actually produce predictions. The second initiative that I'd like to mention is that when we talk about AI, there are at least, from the algorithmic standpoint, there are at least 2 dimensions that we need to consider. The first one being the algorithms and models themselves, the second being the data on which those models are trained in order to produce predictions. And so to that end, we are developing benchmarks or sandboxes that allow us to produce, to have a playground in which the various kind of algorithms can be systematically evaluated, compared to each other, to better understand what the failures and successes of individual algorithms, to identify what is the best performer and whether the best performer can perform well also in very challenging settings that we see occur in the real world, but often do not really occur in data sets that are used for machine learning research. Thank you.
Thank you, Marinka, and thank you to all our panelists for their expert insight. I think we have some time for 1 or 2 questions. So please allow me now to open the floor for discussion with our audience. I remind you that you can all pose questions using the Zoom question and answer function. To stick to our allocated time, I would like to ask the panelists to limit their interventions to no longer than 2 minutes. First is Mohammed Ativala. Mohammed, are you with us?
I am here. Thank you very much. Wow, it was a great presentation. Thank you very much. One of my questions actually is to Andy Wyckoff. Great sets of data. What I was interested is this: why you think GitHub, first of all, like has become kind of a central role for AI kind of collaboration or development, and what does it mean that in India? How do we get India to be involved more in these AI discussions? That's actually going to be my real answer, because as people have noted, the AI network of experts, we have such good collaboration from so many countries, from the UAE and Israel, but we don't have India. And unfortunately, I don't think we even have any colleagues from India on this call as well. I want to get the world's largest democracy more involved in these AI multilateral discussions. And how do we get there?
So, Ambassador, may I quickly just say I couldn't agree more with Mohammed. And we've had engagement over the time with India. It kind of comes and goes. And I think this has to be a priority of ours in our global relations strategy going forward for the OECD, for a variety of reasons that Mohammed has pointed out, but also just because of their role in the AI environment. They will take over the G20 after the Indonesian presidency next year. And so this is another reason for us to increase our connections. I am fortunate enough to participate in a virtual meeting with them in December, and I hope to pull on that and have it a more lasting engagement. Let me just end by saying so much of the Secretariat, which I represent, has its own capabilities, but we really need the diplomatic capabilities and embassies of our members to help us achieve many of our goals. So working together with you, I think, would be a big part of the answer.
Thank you, Andy. I would allow one more question. May I call upon Mark Rothenberg, please? Mr. Rothenberg, are you with us?
Yes, thank you. Congratulations to the OECD for another excellent panel. My question is the topic of implementation of the OECD AI principles. I did see your report just a couple of weeks ago. It was good to note the progress. I was wondering if you could say a few more words. We've heard a lot, of course, about progress, Andy, on research, investment, publication, opportunity in the employment sector for AI. How are we doing on the goals of fairness, accuracy, transparency, efforts to safeguard privacy and fundamental rights?
Please, Andy.
Thank you, and thank you, Mark. It's good to hear from you. Yeah, Mark, I'd say there's 2 ways we're trying to address that, and you're right. We're probably making more substantive progress on the work and innovation and skills side, and that's thanks that's thanks to Germany and Michael here that's really helped us do that. On the more human rights side, we're doing 3 different things, Mark. The first is this toolkit that I talked about briefly, but we're trying to pull together practical AI tools that help you achieve those goals that can act, I think, as a one-stop shop for people coming to try to use those tools to achieve those goals. The second is, the Global Partnership on AI is an element that is beginning to work towards many of these same ends and in kind of move from principles to practice and operationalizing these things. So they too have a working group that focuses just on responsible use of AI. The last thing is right down the street, we are working with UNESCO on this effort as well. But again, Mark, you have made many contributions to the OECD. I welcome your thoughts on how to advancing this goal.
Thank you.
We are approaching the end of first panel. You would not believe, but we are ahead of time. This is good. I'd like to ask our audience to please give our panel a big round of virtual applause. It has been a very informative and insightful discussion. Thank you very much to all our speakers for your interventions and to our audience for their active participation. It has been a pleasure to discuss all the interesting and diverse ways organizations, countries, and researchers are building the evidence base for artificial intelligence. At the end, I don't like to say goodbye, therefore I will say, may the force be with you. I'd like now to introduce our second panel of the day, ensuring global interoperability in assessing and mitigating risk in artificial intelligence. During this panel, speakers will discuss ways to assess and mitigate risk in artificial intelligence systems with a focus on how best to ensure global interoperability. I'd like to start by introducing Karen Perset, who is the head of the Artificial Intelligence Unit at the OECD. Thanks for joining us, Karen. Let me ask you with the first question. The OECD has put together a network of experts on artificial intelligence with more than 200 members from all disciplines and stakeholders groups. How is this network helping to push the boundaries on accountability in artificial intelligence? And how can this work be leveraged to mitigate the risk posed by artificial intelligence systems? Please.
Thank you, Ambassador Jezovnik. So in the past 2 years, we've focused on implementing the OECD AI principles. And I'd like to mention 3 specific projects we're undertaking with the expert network that I think are particularly relevant to today's conversation and that tie into a lot of what's already been said. A first very important project is developing the OECD framework for classifying AI systems. And this work, in fact, is spearheaded and supported by Germany. And you heard from Michael Schonstein a bit earlier. And the basic idea with this work is that different AI systems do very different things and raise very different opportunities and challenges. And so the framework that we expect to launch early 2022 is really a user-friendly tool to help policymakers to assess different types of AI systems and applications. And it looks at 5 key dimensions of any particular AI application. First, the context of the system, including the sector in which the system operates, the scale of its deployment, the type of users that interact with it, and the degree of choice these users have as to use it or not use it. The second dimension covers the data and input that flow from the context into the system itself. And here we look at where the data comes from, the kind of data, and whether rights like IP or privacy are attached to it. The third dimension looks at the AI model itself, which is basically the computational representation of real-world systems. And we look at more technical characteristics like the type of model and the model training method here, all of which impact the factors like transparency of the AI system itself. The fourth dimension looks at the tasks that the AI system performs, as well as its output, like whether it's providing recommendations or predictions, including the level of autonomy of the system itself and of the actions that ensue from it. And so this brings me to the fifth and final dimension, which is cross-sectional and was added recently to reflect the role that humans play in each of the other dimensions and to capture the AI system's impact on people and planet. So this framework is a practical tool for policymakers. We've already used it to classify hundreds of real AI applications. And this will also be the basis for a risk impact assessment tool for AI, which we're developing in cooperation with many partner organizations, particularly the EU, but many others. So this is, I think, a key project to highlight. And the second project I want to mention that Andy also alluded to identifies tools that AI actors can use to make sure that the AI products they develop are trustworthy. And so this includes, and by trustworthy, we mean that abide by the OECD AI principles. And so here we include technical tools like standards, software and research, also drawing on the work of the JRC on standardization that Carlos mentioned, procedural tools like risk management tools and governance frameworks, as well as educational tools that help stakeholders who are involved in or affected by AI systems. So we're building a catalog of tools for implementing trustworthy AI systems that will be available on OECD.ai also next year. And moving forward, we're analyzing in much more depth the different accountability mechanisms for trustworthy AI with standards, of course, but also impact and conformity assessments, assurance mechanisms, and certification tools or certificates. And finally, as AI mentioned, and this is the third project I'd like to just mention briefly, we're planning to develop a new and exciting database of AI incidents called the Global AI Incidents Portal, because having access to information about the AI systems that cause incidents or near incidents is critical to inform policymaking. So with that, thanks, and back to you, Ambassador.
Thank you for that, Karin. I think I speak for everyone when I say that OECD network of experts has really facilitated discussion on various topics related to assessing and mitigating risk on artificial intelligence. I'd like now to pass it on to a speaker from the European Commission, Tatiana Evas. Tatiana, you are legal and policy officer in the Artificial Intelligence Policy Development and Coordination at the DG CNEC, the European Commission. Tatiana, question for you. The proposal for an EA regulation in Europe, so-called famous AI Act, and the coordinated plan for the artificial intelligence have generated significant discussions globally since their launch 6 months ago. In particular, there has been discussion about its implication for accountability and the role of artificial intelligence providers. Could you please elaborate on the Commission's proposed approach to addressing the issues of accountability of artificial intelligence actors? Diana, floor is yours.
Thank you for a very good question and a discussion we had in panel 1 and presentation by Karin. So I'll try to build up on what has been said. Yes, indeed, in April 2021, Commission proposed AI package. So it's really a package, and I would like really to stress all the time that it's a coordinated plan on artificial intelligence, which is the joint commitment between member states and the European Commission. And as we heard today in the first panel, both Spain and Germany, just as an example, mentioned coordinated plan as one of the key, let's say, strategic policy instruments which kind of coordinate and facilitate the measures also at the national level, including, for example, adoption of the national strategies. That was one of the key deliverables of the coordinated plan of 2018, is to facilitate with all EU member states develop and adopt national strategies. And of course, this coordinated plan, which kind of tries to promote the joint actions with member states to promote the ecosystem of excellence, is only one part of a package. And a second part of the package, as mentioned by ambassadors, but also many other speakers, is proposal for Artificial Intelligence Act. And just to, I mean, this public is really familiar with AI Act, but I just want to mention that this AI Act is will aim to proposal, but when adopted, aims to establish new horizontal rules for AI that should lead Europe, should aim to turn Europe into a global hub for trustworthy artificial intelligence. And really the objective is to guarantee safety and fundamental rights of people and businesses while strengthening trustworthy, human-centric and sustainable AI uptake across the European Union. Here also, before I move to your question related to accountability, I just want to again remind maybe key principles of AI Act, because it will help also to explain these accountability instruments. So first of all, what we try to do in the proposal is to make sure that we have no overregulation, because we also understand that AI is something, also technology that could be very beneficial. That's why we put emphasis on trustworthy, human-centric and sustainable. So we want indeed to promote uptake of AI, which will lead to social good. So we want to support innovation, but then we also provide legal certainty. That's why we decided to make a proposal which is based on risk-based approach. And this would lead me in my just a second to explanation of accountability framework. We also wanted to make a regulation which is future-proof. So we have a number of what we think also interesting, innovative regulatory solutions of how to regulate this complex and dynamic policy field. And of course, this makes us a bit different from, for example, Council of Europe or OECD initiatives, because we want to put legally binding rules which would be applicable at the EU market. So future-proof, risk-based, no over-regulation. Then the fourth key principle is really to create a level playing field for EU and non-EU players. So for us, it's also important. Fifth key principle is that this legislation is based on internal market legislation, and it again would lead me to certain instruments which we could use for accountability. So this is legislation which very much builds on the internal market logic and also on very well established and well-proved instruments of policy of product safety legislation, particularly new legislative framework. So we base already on, let's say, experiment and good results at the EU law of product safety legislation, which proved to be very effective. And finally, the sixth key principle is complementarity. So, which is also related to no over-regulation. We want to build on the existing enforcement governance instruments already available under EU, and the proposal of Artificial Intelligence Act will complement already existing EU legislation, for example, product safety, on non-discrimination, on personal data protection, and so on, just to mention some. So this is the context which now I will move to exactly to answer your question. How do we ensure interoperability and accountability? Just 3 bullet points on interoperability. So first of all, we really believe that we need a definition of AI, legally enforceable definition of AI. And the AI proposal very much builds on OECD definition and inspiration from high-level expert group of the European Commission. We really believe that this kind of more global discussion and understanding related to definition is really key to ensure this interoperability, because we need to speak about same things. And for example, research of Joint Research Service of the Commission shows that there are so many different definitions and understanding of AI circulating that we really need to make sure that we speak about that one thing. So one of the, let's say, contribution to this debate of AI proposal is that we suggest and provide this legally enforceable definition of AI. Then second element is really active global cooperation. And here our cooperation with OECD or Council of Europe or bilateral cooperation, for example, with US or Japan, is really critical and very important. That's why we really actively get involved in this global dialogue. And thirdly, as has been mentioned already a number of times, it's really process of standardization, where we also work with private parties to make sure that requirements, legal requirements of AI Act are really also correspond to technical, let's say, capabilities and needs of the industry and other stakeholders. So we are really actively now engaged in this standardization process. So these 3 things, definition of AI, of active global cooperation, and standardization, are really 3 key drivers from our side to ensure interoperability. Then if we speak about accountability, so for us, accountability is one of the key issues. And how do we ensure accountability? First of all, as mentioned already, we really believe, and the whole proposal is based on the logic of risk-based. So the higher the risk, the higher the requirements. Then we also follow life cycle approach. It means that we follow the risks to fundamental rights and human rights through the whole life cycle. And of course, we know and understand that life cycle or value chain of AI systems is quite complex. Therefore, the proposal puts very clear requirements and clearly defined distribution of obligations for the most relevant actors in this complex chain. For example, we have obligations related to providers, users, authorized representative, importers, and distributions. And of course, providers is our key focus, but also other actors have certain requirements and obligations related to their role. Then maybe just to also by way of conclude or round up this discussion of our accountability, we also, and I think that makes EU quite different from other international initiatives, we have also very strong enforcement and governance mechanisms, framework, So like I mentioned, we base very much our proposal on product safety legislation. So we have really strong governance and enforcement framework, which makes the, for example, procedure for conformity assessment or post-market surveillance procedures are quite effective instruments where we could really make sure and ensure that the requirements and legal obligations included in the Act will be sufficiently enforced. And with this, I think I will conclude my first intervention. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that interesting intervention, Tatiana. I'd now like to shift to focus on to Latin America and Caribbean. We are very grateful to have Cristina Pombo with us today. Cristina, you are the Principal Advisor and Head of Digital and Data Cluster at the Inter-American Development Bank. Question for you. How is the American Development Bank enabling responsible and widespread adoption of artificial intelligence in Latin America and Caribbean, including by helping to manage risk of using artificial intelligence for public policy? Have you come across case studies illustrating the interoperability of trustworthy artificial intelligence development and deployment at the regional level? Please, Christina.
Thank you, Ambassador. And thank you to the OECD and the Slovenian government for the invitation. I think enabling accountability for trustworthy is one of the biggest issues right now. And digitalization and artificial intelligence are key, or we think they are key to facilitate access to basic services such as health and education, as the previous panel alluded. This is part of IDB's mission to improve lives and an important pillar of our Vision 2025 strategy. So at the IDB, we created what we call Fair LAC. It's a regional initiative that leverages efforts on partnerships between the public and private sector, the civil society, and academic institutions designed to influence public policy and entrepreneurial ecosystem in the promotion of responsible AI, in particular when providing social services. And for doing so, FAIRLAC is adopting the OECD principles, ethical principles for AI, and following UNESCO's recommendations for responsible AI. To enable the responsible widespread adoption of AI in the region, we are working on 3 different dimensions to apply these ethical principles into practice. The first is creating a diverse network to better inform the conversation on AI risks. The second is building capacities at local level by developing pilot projects and providing workshops and learning activities. And the third is developing practical tools. So how do we get these principles applied in practice, or how do we ensure that AI projects comply with ethical guidelines? It's precisely through those tools to guide and facilitate the process. Therefore, among some other tools we have developed, the FAIRLAC initiative and the OECD Policy Observatory partnered to help move the AI policy discussion from high level to practice and implementation. In a joint effort with the OECD, we co-published the Data Science Toolkit for Responsible Use of AI for Public Policy. The toolkit provides technical guidance for developers in public policy teams that wish to use AI technologies to improve their decision-making processes and outcomes. And for each phase of the AI system lifecycle, planning and design, data collection and processing, model building and validation, and deployment and monitoring, the toolkit identifies the most common challenges of using AI in public policy context and outlines practical mechanisms to detect and mitigate these challenges. So in that sense, we acknowledge accountability as a cross-cutting dimension in the AI system lifecycle. Accountability aims to provide explanatory and transparency-enhancing measures to promote understanding of the mechanism through which an AI system produces an output and the user's capacity to identify and challenge errors or unexpected results. And in addition to that, we have developed 2 complementary tools to guide trustworthy AI development: the ethical self-assessment and the project management toolkit for project leaders responsible for designing and deploying an AI solution. All of them are available on our webpage. And to see practical examples, we at the FAIRLAC initiative, we have an observatory of use cases, and we are in fact now updating that observatory to to see or map what is happening in Latin America and the Caribbean with AI, which are the real use cases happening in the region, and what are the how are the implementation of those principles there. So I invited you to visit the webpage and to see exactly what is happening in the region, which in some cases is pretty unknown. And if you have any questions, so here you have the contact information. So back to you, Ambassador, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Christina, for that interesting insight into the adoption of artificial intelligence in Latin America and the Caribbean, and the great work of the International Development Bank of Inter-American Development Bank. I'm sure in the new report you just launched on the responsible artificial intelligence use for public policy will be of great interest to many policymakers watching us today. I'd now like to ask the question to Gregor Storion, who is chair of the Ad Hoc Committee on Analytical Intelligence of the Council of Europe. Gregor, almost 1 year ago, the Council of Europe's Ad Hoc Committee on Artificial Intelligence adopted a feasibility study on legal framework on artificial intelligence, which took into account standards and existing relevant international legal instruments. How is the Council of Europe ensuring consistency between its instrument and developments taking place in other international and regional fora, such as the European Union, the UNESCO, and the OECD? Please, Gregor.
Thank you, Ambassador Yashovnik. CAHI is an ad hoc intergovernmental committee, which means that it has a limited time frame and also a strict substantive and procedural frame. Within 2 years, we were supposed to prepare a feasibility study on the legal framework for design, development, and application of AI in line with the existing standards on democracy, human rights, and rule of law. And this was only the first part of the expected deliverables, and we have completed it in last year. The second part of the deliverable is to elaborate potential elements of a legal framework, and we need to do this by the end of this year. As it happens, the final meeting of our preparatory working group is ongoing as we speak, and the materials will be submitted to the CAHI plenary at the end of this month. In line with both the outcomes of the feasibility study and the subsequent instructions by the Committee of Ministers, which is the statutory decision-making body of the Council of Europe, which, by the way, consists of 47 member states, basically all EU countries, plus 20 others. We are focusing on preparing a list of elements for a legally binding instrument, as negotiations on such a document of transversal nature are supposed to start by May next year at the latest. The fact that we are working on a legally binding, enforceable instrument sets us apart from many other initiatives. The additional fact that we need to find a high level of consensus furthermore limits our maneuverability. That said, it also provides a hugely valuable litmus test for determining actual dedication of member states to regulation of the matter and their commitment to uphold human rights, democracy, and the rule of law. While we remain at the level of soft law, such as recommendations, there is not much pushback. The closer you get to formulations that can actually limit behavior of stakeholders or allow enforceability of rules, the pressure, however, increases, both among national stakeholders and even more so among international counterparts. We have a broad and dedicated membership, which on many levels overlaps with other initiatives that you have mentioned. And it is indicative of increasingly diverging views. By design, we also include other international organizations, and we are completely transparent about the reasoning behind particular formulations in our documents. Currently, we are trying to find consensus on expert level on as many elements that will add to the existing framework. But at the end, the main binding horizontal instrument will be based on negotiations on political level, and these are yet to come. Various initiatives are progressing at different speeds, from different starting positions and with different perspectives and aspirations. Different aspects also gain different speeds or attention. And I appreciate the last question we heard at the previous panel from Mark Rothenberg. But can the consistency of the initiatives be achieved with often diverging views and interests? Well, the broader you go in substance, composition of members, and level of obligation, the harder it is to achieve consensus. Also, and most importantly, these organizations and initiatives have different organizational goals. To simplify, Council of Europe deals with human rights, democracy, and the rule of law. EU with safety, security, and the common market. OECD with economic development, UNESCO with science, culture, and education. This is also the matrix for which they were set up and why and how member countries participate in their work. So the focus should be primarily on finding cohesion among and within member countries. And organizations can, and these organizations can and should contribute also in this strategic direction in order to find complementarity in their approaches. It is my personal desire, and one that seems to be shared by many other experts, that many elements, especially of technical or methodological nature, can and indeed need to be shared, or they need to be common in order to provide for an effective framework. We need to take each other's work into account sincerely and by taking into consideration particular competences. Volume, ambition, or desire to be first in something should not be decisive factors. Most importantly, we should prevent duplication or even contrary approaches. For example, definition and classification by OECD have already been mentioned, and I support that. Human rights, democracy, and rule of law impact assessment is something that we can bring to the table and can be reused by others. Eventually, I hope to see complementarity of instruments, if not compatibility. If not, I'm afraid we're not doing much. We might even be counterproductive in our efforts. So thank you for your question for now.
Thank you, Gregor. That was a really insightful intervention. It's great to see the cooperation on artificial intelligence policy taking place between international organizations. I'd now like to ask a question to our final panelist, Marko Grobolig. Marko, you are the artificial intelligence researcher and digital champion at the Artificial Intelligence Lab of Slovenia Josef Stefan Institute, and you are as well the head of ERCA, as well as a co-chair of the OECD Working Group on the Classification of Artificial Intelligence, which was mentioned earlier today by Karin Percy. Question for you as well. Marko, in recent years, the public debate has moved from discussing whether certification is needed in artificial intelligence to how to make it reality as a crucial component of the artificial intelligence accountability ecosystem. What are your thoughts on certification in artificial intelligence, specifically what it should include and how it could be implemented, leveraging the efforts that the other panelists have described today? Marko, floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Ambassador. Yes, certification, right? So, okay, I'll try to answer three questions, right? So first, why certification is needed, what it should include, and also how we could implement it, right? So we heard before Marinka Žitnik, right, discussing certification in the domain of health for particular applications which they do at Harvard, right? This is like a good example where some of the forefronts is happening, but still certification is missing on the larger scale, and especially it's missing the breadth, right? Now, okay, we all agree that there's some kind of global consensus that AI is influencing our, let's say, personal and societal lives, right? And we certainly can say that we have two key observations, right? For most of the people, still AI is a mystery and creates fears. This is, we can observe this every day, right? But we can say even more, right? Not just for average people, right? Non-experts, right? But even for experts, for creators of technology like me and Marinka and others, right? In many ways, we often don't understand all the possible consequences which AI could have, right? So once when we are creating tools, we see the problem ahead of us to be solved, but usually these solutions have many more consequences, which often is really uneasy to predict, right? So that's why we talk about regulation on one side, right, to remove fears and to make technology more trustful. But of course, the final stage of all these discussions is to make the actionable implementation of regulation, which effectively is certification, right? So this is like putting a mirror in front of this technology to see what's actually happening, right? So this is where why we need a certification. Now, for certification, we could say that we would need like two levels of certification. First question we need to answer is an AI system which we try to certify, is it actually doing what creators are claiming that it's doing, right? So this is often very unclear, right? So we need to agree on some kind of guarantees and uncertainties because AI systems are often too complex that the decision would be, or any kind of claim would be 100%, right? So we need to be aware of these uncertainties as well. And we, at the same time, we need to have performance guarantees, robustness, transparency, and others, right? And the second level we need to include in certification is an AI system compatible with a particular value standard, right? This would include things what Gregor was just explaining, right? Like human rights or AI Act or OECD AI principles and or UNESCO document and so on, right? So two levels, I said. So first, the technical level, right? Is the system producing what it's claiming to produce, and is it compatible to some kind of value system? Now, the first part is kind of easier, the technical, right? The second one is a little bit harder, right? So now, how we could approach this certification? There's no general solution yet. I mean, there are trials on different ends, but there's no solution yet, right? But what would be ingredients? Okay, it was mentioned already. First, we need an operational AI definition, and the OECD definition goes in that line. Also, the fact that European Commission took OECD definition as a basis, right? And the high-level group from European Commission also is pretty much in the same line as OECD definition. So the point is that definition is not just good for lawyers, but it needs to be good also on for engineers, right? But definition is not enough, right? So Karine before was mentioning the AI classification framework we are building in OECD. So this expands the definition into a little bit broader context so that we would understand parts of the definition and detail these parts to that degree that actually we can build something like certification on one side and legal documents on the other side, right? Then we can learn a lot from the science, right? Because what is science? Science is a lot about developing standards to verify its claims, any kind of science, natural sciences in particular, right? And the science is a lot about preventing scientists to lie or mislead themselves, right? In the same way, certification needs to be a system or an approach which would prevent lying about whatever AI system we would like to certify. And the last point, which I think sometimes sounds like a little bit controversial, but I think eventually this will be needed, that AI system will have to have a standardized backdoor, right, for testing and monitoring on the fly, because AI systems are very dynamic. You know, you cannot certify something today and while the system changes in a few hours to something else, and certification might not be useful anymore. So it needs to be verified all the time. So in principle, we would have like three modes of certification. One would be obviously methodological review. Is the methodology correct, right? The construction of the system, is it correct? So this is something which I think we can do, right? Then offline, there's sandbox testing, which was mentioned by Marinka and a couple of others before, right? This is like a semi-automatic type of verification, right? So it's like simulating real-time, real-life usage of a system. And the third one, which seems a little bit still untouched in the discussions, is this fully automatic certification, which where the certification system actually observes an AI system while it works during operation, right? And of course, result of certification needs to be expressed in some kind of human understandable KPIs, right? Which can be either understood by lawyers on one side and engineers on the other side. And maybe just last few thoughts. What would be this proper or first line of technical steps towards broader AI system certification? So one first thing, we need to standardize classes of AI systems. So AI system is not just one type, but we have classes of AI systems, and some are kind of friendlier towards certification, some are really hard. So we need to admit that some parts of AI are really hard to certify still at this stage, right? Then we need to define and also standardize hard and soft KPIs describing an AI system. So this OECD AI classification, AI system classification goes in this direction. Then standardizing the technical means, so this backdoor, what I mentioned before, technical means for testing and monitoring AI systems. So this, I think it's necessity. And of course, then the last stage would be to build some kind of operational prototype certification systems which would match and which would be useful for, again, for legal lawyers, right, on one side and engineers on the other side. So, and the final proof will be actual success stories where eventually the result would be to gain trust into AI systems. So this is like a maybe quick overview how I see certification. So a lot of things are happening, but still, I think most of the questions are ahead of us. Certainly, we don't have anything yet which could be broadly deployed. And this is, I think, is the task for the next, not next year, but next few years, I guess. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Marko. I'd now like to ask one question to all of our panelists. From your interventions today, it is clear that most of your organization's work emphasizes the value of risk assessments and lifecycle approaches to help manage risk. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the benefits of that approach, how you envisage implementing it, and any potential drawbacks to a lifecycle approach as well, if relevant. Karin, would you like to start?
Sure. Thank you, Ambassador. So we think that the AI system lifecycle as the basis for a common, we hope, approach to creating accountability, can be the basis for a common approach to creating accountability by facilitating, for example, the interoperability of standards and of risk management frameworks. Christina already said a lot about joint work the IDB and OECD have been conducting on this topic, and a report that I think just is coming up today, relaunched today, so it should be available on the websites. And there are many reasons for using the AI system lifecycle as a kind of common framework internationally. First and foremost, this is the direction that many key actors are already taking, from standards bodies like the ISO, European standards bodies at the request of the European Commission, but also, in the United States, for example, the Congress has asked the United States NIST, which stands for National Institute for Standards and Technology, to also develop a risk management framework, and many, many more. So those are just a few sort of large ones, but the life cycle uses language and terminology that is widely accepted by engineers and computer scientists, by product managers in companies and business, as well as policymakers, and therefore it can provide the much needed common ground, because sometimes we use very different language to talk about different things that at the end of the day we need this common ground to develop common solutions. And then from our perspective, in the context of the classification work, the AI system lifecycle maps very well to the key dimensions of the classification framework I mentioned earlier. So for example, the data and input dimension of the classification includes the data collection and processing lifecycle stage. So it maps directly on, and so we can reuse much of those criteria in a lifecycle approach. And then the tools to mitigate AI system risks also map very well to the lifecycle phases. So by way of example, and this is a little bit of a technical example, but one of a broadly used tool is the Google model cards, which help developers ensure transparency in the model building and verification phase. So correspond to that specific lifecycle phase. And the AI system lifecycle stages, if you look at those on a vertical level, so this is more of a process, let's say, of software of AI system development, and the AI principles, if you look at those, they're more sort of or orthogonal, horizontal sort of values-based criteria, are orthogonal. That is that at each stage of the life cycle, the 5 stages we've identified, we can assess and mitigate the risks posed to each of the principles, monitor the implementation of mitigation strategies, and provide assurance that the system meets a given quality standard. And the AI, the lifecycle approach also makes it easier to link risk management activities with the different actors, the AI actors that are, those who play an active role in developing and deploying the AI systems at each stage. And at the same time, this lifecycle approach, as you mentioned, presents some challenges. One of the key challenges, I think, has already been mentioned by Marco, and I'd just like to reemphasize that one, which is that AI systems can evolve and often do evolve in time and operate with different degrees of autonomy, which means that some risks have to be reassessed more frequently, and in some cases will have to be assessed on a continuous basis, which will which is very different from the models that the assessment models we're currently using. And so that will represent at the very least a very big business model change in standards bodies and certification authorities. But those are just a few of the benefits and one of the drawbacks. Back to you. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Karin. Tatiana, would you be so kind and share some thoughts of yours with us, please?
Yeah, I would build very much on what just Karin said. I think I agree with most of what has been said. And just exactly our starting point in the AI proposal was to look at the specific characteristics of AI technologies and the risk that this specific technology generates. And due to its very dynamic and, let's say, autonomous component of AI technologies, which makes it quite different from, let's say, more static products, which traditionally we try to certify and regulate, makes this life cycle approach, in my opinion, like really essential for this technology. And that's why in AI proposal, we focus on different stages, as Karin said, and we look at the stage before the product is put on the market. There, for example, conformity assessment and voluntary codes of conduct for non-high risk AI systems play a great role. So here also the work of OECD could be very essential. Yes, so for high risk, we have legal requirements and obligations which are included in the Act, but also Commission promotes a voluntary codes of conduct for non-high risk AI systems. But this is clearly not sufficient, exactly due to specific characteristics of AI. So we need to complement it with also post-market surveillance mechanisms. That's why we have more holistic approach in the AI proposal, exactly to cover for this. And maybe as a supplement to what is not yet covered in the AI Act, but what will follow up from the Commission side is also liability package, which would then take as a next step also for liability, which could come even if, in spite of all ex ante and ex post obligations on the providers and users, certain risks still materialize. So how to compensate for that? So this is something which Commission is considering to come up with the beginning of next year. And maybe just speak about the implementation. I think one of the, as I mentioned at the end of my presentation, strength of the EU Act proposal and generally of EU law system is that we have very strong enforcement and governance system. And specifically for EU Act, we built on the collaboration between national governance systems, so national notifying bodies will play a really essential role, and we will have a governance system, a small layer at the EU level, which should ensure this kind of synergies and exchange of information, and also moving into the same direction, which is also very much in line with the aim and the vision of the Coordinated Plan on AI. And here I just again want to highlight that the really Coordinated Plan on AI Act is really a package. And then, of course, decentralized enforcement of EU law, which is really based on the national courts and enforcement and remedies and the, penalties in certain cases. So this makes, of course, EU law, and this package on AI regulation is really unprecedented. And let's see how it will develop. Still, as I agree with Marco, still a lot of work to be done, both of standards on enforcement and making it all operational. But I think we're already making quite big steps forward, jointly, not only EU, but also working with the global partners, and OECD here and Council of Europe, of course, play very much collaborative and very strong supportive role. Thank you.
Thanks, Tatiana. Christina, may I invite you to share some thoughts with us?
Thank you very much. And I just want to compliment, because I completely agree with what Karina and Tatiana said. This approach for us facilitates the connection with the public policy cycle. It's helped to address multiple social problems and to put the problem or the need, the human being in the center, avoiding the techno-solutionism approach, right? This has also helped us to organize the discussion and to identify a specific risk associated with each stage. For us, the life cycle helps to simplify a conversation that is not simple, but needs to be comprehensive. A linear approach, we've found that it's not very appropriate because the nature of AI is iterative. Each step could or should have multiple iterations that could have implications on previous or next stages in the life cycle. Fairness and bias issues with AI will require substantial efforts to address them. And some steps are clear. And as Tatiana or Marco said, there are some things that we've done. That first, companies or governments using AI should disclose where AI systems are used and for what purpose. Second, AI engineers should be trained with a set of standard principles, like an adapted physician's Hippocratic Oath. Engineers need to understand that the profession embeds ethical choices into products that make life-changing decisions and thus promise to protect users' rights. Third, rigorous testing should be required and embedded in AI training tools to provide warnings or disallow use of models trained on data with unfair demographic coverage. And four, new laws requiring AI audits could be passed. If a company receives enough complaints, it could be AI audited for fairness, disclosure, and privacy protection. The same way it might face a tax audit if its books look fishy. All new technologies have had risk and downsides. History suggested that with time, many of early errors of a new technology will fix and improve upon. We are confident that with the technology and policy solutions to address the challenges of AI's influence, bias, and opaque operations. But first, we must inform people about the gravity of problems, and then to mobilize them to work towards a solution. So that is why we think this is the best approach to go forward. Thank you, Ambassador.
Thank you, Christina. Gregor, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ambassador. So one of the main challenges with the use of AI or any potentially disruptive technology for that matter is how to limit the human condition of ambition and competition and to prevent the stakeholders from abusing their positions within the existing context of rights and obligations. With AI, the danger, of course, is also various additional risks of a multitude of potentially unintended or even unforeseeable consequences. Pattern recognition, automated classification and categorization, decision-making and scaling capabilities in connection with an abundance of data, historical and live, provide fertile ground for optimization of some of the existing human tendencies. And as we have seen in many parts of the world, authoritarian aspirations are thriving. And we do not need to look towards science fiction to see the risks. Existing challenges and increasing inequalities should be instructive enough. And when it comes to the work we're doing with KHI, we are looking not only at AI as an application or technological aspect, but also the phases of design, development, and application, which are focused on the rights and obligations of humans in the process. And currently, under preparation of risk assessment methodology, or impact assessment methodology to be more exact, we understand that not all applications require an impact assessment, an impact on human rights, rule of law and democracy, only the ones that have a high level of risk. And currently we have 4 degrees of risks taken into consideration, and we will propose this to the plenary and the Committee of Ministers. And we see 4 phases that might be necessary in the process. One is risk identification. The second is impact assessment. The third is governance assessment, which is the assessment of roles and responsibilities of duty bearers, right holders and stakeholders in implementing and governing the mechanisms to mitigate the impact. And the fourth is mitigation and evaluation, which is identification of suitable mitigation measures and ensuring continuous evaluation. So we come here to very similar definitions as you, Ambassador, already set out in the question, and as they were presented also by other speakers. We have, I think, a common understanding of both risk assessment and or risk-based approach. Not everything needs to be evaluated, basically, but only things that have a significant risk. Otherwise, we also waste the resources for impact assessment and so on. And the second is, well, I'm losing focus now, but I think I said.
Thank you, Gregor. Thank you, Gregor. Lastly, Marco, we are a little bit behind the time schedule, so if you could really explain in 2 minutes your thoughts, please, Marco.
Just a couple of thoughts. First, related to risk-based approach, I was really happy to see that the European Commission took this risk-based approach, because at this stage, I think this is the only, or maybe the most pragmatic way to start operating with AI regulation in a practical way. Especially why? Because we are still in fairly early stage. And we are still learning about AI and all the consequences which AI by itself has to the society, and especially AI in a combination with other technologies and other societal issues where it is starting appearing. So this is just my sentence on this risk-based approach that I think is the right way to go at this stage. Might not be in 10 years, right? But today I think it's the right way. So when the way how to deal with this, I mean, this is how Karine was explaining, it should be approached in a structured way, right? So, and the way how, at least in OECD working groups, we deal with risks, I think this is more like the task for the next year. It's a very structured way, and it's really based on the definition, framework, and life cycle itself, right? Now, we should be also aware that AI is not a static matter, right? So the AI of today is not something which is AI of which will happen in like 5 or 10 years from now, right? So today we have something like what we can call narrow AI. It's solving complex problems, but most of the problems are really narrow, right? So, and that's why they have also sort of limited consequences. But in the future, we can expect something which we could call more like holistic AI systems, which will address way broader aspects of life and society, and will bring many more uncertainties. And also the risks which will appear will be different from the AI which we know today, right? We can certainly say this because AI which is being developed today, right? I'm part of this, right? So will come in practical everyday life like in 5 years from now, right? And in that sense, we can say this. Just to to re-emphasize, so risk-based approach is correct. We need to be aware that this will evolve, and probably the first stages, these risk-based regulations might have also failures, and we'll have to adapt them to whatever will happen in the future period. Thanks.
Thanks for that, Marco, and thanks again to all of our panelists today for interesting discussions. Please allow me now to open the floor for questions from our audience. I remind you that you can all ask questions using the Zoom question and answer function. To stick to our allocated time, I would like to ask the panelists to limit their interventions to no longer than 2 minutes. For the start, I choose the question for Tatiana. What role do standards play in helping to increase accountability in artificial intelligence, and how can their development and use be incentivized? Please.
Standards for us is really key, and we already started to do pre-standardization work and work with the EU standardization bodies, but also international bodies. So we already have preparatory work with Senelec, ETSI, and also international organizations like IEEE, standardization organizations. So we really find it important for, like I mentioned, for interoperability, and we really believe in that this kind of a standard should be global. It would really help providers to comply and also make it easier to meet the requirements for high-risk AI systems, which are now included. So we very much support the standardization process.
Thank you. I would like to thank as well Gregor for giving an input of his last thoughts that he lost the track before. Is there any other question? Otherwise, I will ask one more question to Karin. How is the OECD working to ensure that its classification of artificial systems stands the test of time, given that artificial intelligence systems are constantly evolving? Please, Karin.
Thank you, Ambassador. I think there are a couple response elements to that question. I think that the framework itself is quite abstract in the sense that it does not tie us to any specific types of technology. And the 4 dimensions are, we think future-proof in the sense that we include all types of AI systems. And so we think that the core dimensions won't change. Now, we do foresee this to be a living document as we move forward and we develop, let's say in the AI model section, we develop more like specific training methodologies, and those will constantly evolve. We envisage that will be certain components of the framework will evolve over time. It's sort of a living document, but the main framework itself can stand the test of time because it covers all types of different AI systems and is quite generic, quite generic in that sense.
Thank you, Karin. I'm sad to say that we have run out of time, so that concludes the second panel and this very interesting discussion on enabling accountability for trustworthy artificial intelligence. Thank you very much to all our speakers for your interventions and to our audience for their active participation. I'm sure this is a discussion that will continue for years to come, with more and more best practices and lessons learned to share. Once again, it has been a pleasure to moderate this webinar and be part of this important discussion on enabling accountability for artificial intelligence. I would also like to give a special thanks to you, to the OECD Secretariat, the Republic of Slovenia, and ERCAA for organizing this event. I would like to remind you that all that, if you missed all or part of this event, we will be posting a link to the recording on oecd.ai and on erca.org. I would like to thank our audience once again to tuning and engaging so actively, and of course, thank our distinguished speakers for the wonderful discussions. I wish you all great rest of your day. Thank you and bye-bye.
Can maybe just...
Karin, you would like to say something?
Ambassador, I would just like to take the opportunity to thank the Luis Aranda and Francesca Chica, my colleagues, particularly Luis, who has masterminded this workshop. And so I just wanted to recognize his contributions right here. Thank you.
My greetings go to them too, and all thanks for all the OECD team and all speakers. Thank you. Be in touch. Bye bye.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Thanks.